We call it the Book of Genesis because it is the story of the beginning of all things, and also of the beginning of God's people as a people. Genesis means beginning or origin. It's an origin story. There's a lot of debate among Christians as to how much of the book of Genesis is factually true and how much is symbolic or archetypal. That is, they'll ask if stories like the creation account or Noah's flood can be considered true stories, or if they're just legends that tell us something about God and about the nature of the world, but didn't actually happen. Now, Lutherans have historically held that these stories are to be taken as a record of real, true events, things that actually happened. And this is actually quite reasonable. First, we might ask the question, why would anyone assume that these stories are not real, true events? The simple answer is that the scientific theory tells a story of the world that is billions of years old, with millions upon millions of years of evolution leading up to the existence of human beings. And the Bible, on the other hand, tells a story of 6 days of creation, with God forming man out of the dust of the ground on the sixth day. They're two very different stories, but because so much of our culture is grounded in science, and so many people base their decisions on what scientific evidence can tell them, it seems almost silly to people to hold on to this 6 day creation account. So many Christians today will try and find their way around it. But they would not do so if they were not relying on science so much. If they assumed that God is right and science might be mistaken, rather than assuming science is right and that they're mistaken about God, they would never come to this conclusion. The point is this: without science telling us that evolution is true, we wouldn't see the creation stories as symbolic or archetypal. We'd take them for what they say. So then we ask, why should we trust the science? Doesn't science change its message every few years? Isn't science always adjusting its claims about truth based on the latest research? That's the point, isn't it? And if that's true, then why put our faith in something that's always changing, rather than in the words of God who never changes? Isn't it more reasonable to believe what the words of the Bible plainly say? And that's another point in why it's reasonable to take the events of Genesis as fact. The words say it plainly. The meaning of the text is very clear. Day, when used throughout all of the Old Testament, always means a 24-hour day, unless the context clearly says otherwise. For example, sometimes the word will say in the days of King David or in those days, but then the word is plural. The context is clearly telling us that we're not talking about a single day. And even still, it isn't talking about an ambiguous period of millions of years. It's talking about a clearly defined period limited by the people or events it's talking about. In other words, day never means a vague, long period of millions of years. The Bible never uses it that way. Furthermore, the Genesis story talks about evening and morning, clear indicators that we're talking about a normal day here. So we have no reason at all to assume that the story of creation in Genesis 1 is a legend or symbolic or archetypal. The text just doesn't require that of us. And since science is unreliable, well, we take the story as it's written. And if it's true as it's written, then so are all the other stories. As incredible as it is to think of a worldwide flood, it's certainly within God's power not only to make it happen, but to use it for his glory. So what makes Genesis powerful and important is that it shows us who made all things and why he made all things, and it shows us how he made all things. The who is God, our creator and Lord. The why is for his glory and for our good and to have a relationship with us. The how is by his almighty power, by his word. This is where it gets really good, because we're told in John that the word, God's word, the word by which all things were made, that word is God, and that word took on flesh. So when we look at Genesis, we're really looking at the works of Jesus at the start of all things, the eternal Son of God stepping into time and with his hands crafting a world and a home for us. Even more beautiful is the fact that we have his promise that he will remake this world on the last day, eliminate the sin that infected it so early on, give us an eternal home with him. That's the story we're all living in right now, a story that hasn't ended yet. Genesis is the start.